Hello everyone and welcome to our Symposium, Border 100, Histories and Reflections. The Symposium will be taking place across the next 10 days with one or two events a day, except for Sunday and Wednesday. I'm very pleased to welcome such a high quality group of scholars to give these lectures and to join in these panel discussions. But before we commence tonight's lecture, we're going to hear from the Cathaoirleach of Louth County Council, P.O. Smith.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to formally launch the Border 100 Symposium, one of the final events in the Louth County Council Decade of Centenaries programme for 2021. We are now in the most sensitive phase of the Decade of Centenaries, 2020 to 2023, as we mark the centenaries of the struggle for independence, partition and the foundation of Northern Ireland, the Civil War and the foundation of the state. Throughout the centenary commemorations, Louth County Council has followed the guidelines of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. Two of the significant events that the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations highlighted will be covered by the symposium include the foundation of Northern Ireland, partition and the drawing of the border, and the experiences of minorities and border communities in Ireland from 1918 to 2023. I wish to congratulate Louth Library Services on their work over the past number of years in programming for the centenary, and also acknowledge the work of Dr. Thomas Tormey, the historian in residence, who has worked tirelessly in curating this symposium. Dr. Tormey has gathered together local, national and international academics and historians who, over the next 2 weeks, will cover a vast array of topics and issues. This symposium is entirely virtual, allowing us to reach a much wider audience, including diaspora all over the world. I hope everyone enjoys the wide range of topics and panel talks planned over the next week, and we welcome feedback and audience interaction during and following each event.
Gura Mahagat a Cathaoirleach, and for tonight's lecture, we are joined by Dr. Tim Wilson, who is the head of the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St Andrews University in Scotland. Tim has written a recent book called Killing Strangers, but tonight he's going to return to some earlier research, his first book, which was Frontiers of Violence, Conflict and Identity in Ulster and Upper Silesia, 1918 to 1922, with particular reference to the killings at Altnaveigh in June 1922. So take it away, Tim.
Thanks very much, Tommy, and thank you for this very kind invitation to kick off the series tonight. My thanks to Louth Library Service for hosting me. It's a huge honour to speak tonight, especially on a notorious local tragedy and what the councillor just called the most sensitive phase of the Decade of Commemorations. As your sharp ears will all have picked up, the South Armagh border is not my home stamping ground by origin. So I'm very mindful of that, and I hope that I will do the subject justice. I want to also pay tribute to those excellent historians who've paved the way to look at the Altnaveigh killings. I'm thinking particularly of Matthew Lewis, Donal Hall, Robert Lynch, Conor McNamara. There's been really quite an impressive tranche of research that's come out in the last 10 years since I did my doctoral work that Tommy was kind enough to reference. This entire period was really very neglected for very long and has now sort of finally begun to get some of the attention that has long been its due. So I don't want to sort of just replicate or repeat their excellent work. What I thought I might do tonight is use the Altnaveigh killings really as a sort of, if I can put it this way, a kind of high springboard from which to launch into what is hopefully an elegant dive rather than a flat belly flop into wider and deeper waters, really a series of reflections as the border nears its 100th birthday, for better or worse, on the whole concept of sectarian violence and sectarian conflict in general. And I'm mindful in exploring these sensitive topics that I'm very unwisely going against the excellent advice of the late and great Seamus Heaney that about sectarianism, whatever you say nothing. I will try to say something. So I think just to sort of set the scene theoretically, because we all love theory, don't we? All my students love theory. But just to sort of offer a couple of comments before I get into the nitty-gritty of Altnaveigh. Really, what do I mean by sectarianism? I suppose in sociological terms, I'm thinking of it as a form of social closure, to use the phrase from Max Weber, a way of erecting a boundary so that groups can try and restrict access to rewards and privileges. And the thing that is kind of striking about sectarianism is that religion and religious identities are being used instrumentally in this way, in a way that people often feel at some deep level is inappropriate or offensive. So to borrow a quote from an American visitor actually to Ireland in 1889, he said this, quote, "If you wish to buy a mackerel from a fish dealer, you always inquire of somebody beforehand the name of his church, and you judge the quality of the fish not by the fish itself, but by the theology of the man who sold it." So really, what I'm getting at is sectarianism, not really so much as the politics of identity as the politics of identification. It's a way of categorizing people, and it's something that often feels inappropriate or taboo, actually. I mean, I've taught quite a lot on Northern Ireland, especially to English students many years back, and they often found the very concept of sectarianism, really quite offensive and strange. Although, if you sort of change the categorization and sort of point out to them that how they classified people on class came as absolute second nature, whether someone dropped their H's and spoke estuary English or had tattoos, they didn't think that was a strange way of categorizing people at all. So, really it is, as I say, something that I'm looking at as a form of classification, but also in specific circumstances, a way of structuring violence and structuring and selecting targets. So when I talk about sectarian conflicts, really what I'm talking about is a conflict that works through this form of targeting. And it's worth, I think, saying that, sectarian conflict is not a pure metal. It's always an alloy. It's always mixed in with other forces, other motivations. And it's political. Very often sectarian violence is seen as somehow a kind of, well, this is all just about hate crimes, and it doesn't really touch on politics. I think that's a mistaken reading, and that we would do better to take it seriously as a form of political violence that is deserving of serious analysis. And just as an aside, I've often thought it sort of strange that very often in describing violence as sectarian, there's a kind of adverbial intensifier, a sort of strengthening adverb is put in there as, nakedly sectarian or raw sectarianism, sort of adjective or adverb is kind of thrown in to strengthen it. And God knows what naked sectarianism is. I'd love to see a kind of analysis of the concept. But it suggests to me that there's something sort of, just calling things sectarian doesn't really take us very far. We need to perhaps think a little bit more deeply. Not perhaps so much on motivations, because they are always hard to read, as we shall see when we come to look at why the Altnaveigh killings happened, but particularly to sort of shift the focus, as I've sometimes tried to do in my work, onto effects. If events are understood as sectarian, then what is the effect of that? And the argument that I've tried to make in some of my work is that it can have a particularly resonant and destabilizing effect on social stability. And it achieves this effect through what I call its tightly restricted randomness. In other words, this type of violence is restricted in that it usually works by, if you are shot as a Catholic, only Catholics are targeted, but it is random because any Catholic will be targeted. And that combination of, say, being tightly restricted and random seems to give it a particularly pernicious and sort of fearful quality that is really very disturbing to live through. And really, my reflections here are taken from a previous life where I ran a youth club in North Belfast. And what struck me about my friends in that estate was that they all kind of felt that the violence of the troubles that had been the modern troubles, the recent troubles that had been most disturbing had been this kind of sectarian stuff. And yet, in most accounts of the troubles, that's not really seen as the main story. The main story is seen as a Republican insurgency against the British state. That's always intrigued me, and it's something that I've really spent quite a bit of time thinking about, and we'll talk about again tonight. So, that's really the sort of the pitch, that if we look at sectarian violence as a form of representative violence in which victims are chosen not for what they've done, but for the wider community or group that they stand for, then we might get a little bit closer to understanding the sometimes, say, extraordinary resonant effect of this type of violence. A little of this violence can go a long way. It can create a sort of small input, large output problem. Okay, I think I'll just shift the focus a little bit to sort of talk about Altnaveigh itself and what happened there, so that perhaps some of these more abstract and theoretical reflections can take on perhaps a bit more life. I'm assuming that there's a certain amount of local knowledge in the virtual room, but it's always dangerous to assume that everyone is familiar with an incident. So please bear with me if this is familiar to you. We need to sort of cast our minds back, or imagine rather, as the very turbulent situation in the early summer of 1922, in which the 6 counties of Northern Ireland had emerged as an entity with its own government, but hadn't yet fully consolidated its authority. It was facing a fairly major Republican insurgency from the IRA that really sort of heated up in the early summer. There was sort of an attempt at a grand offensive, although it all kind of went off at slightly different places at slightly different times. But at the same time, of course, in the 26 counties, the IRA itself was in the process really of dissolving. So there's a kind of race for 2 civil wars that are trying to be born at the same time. One, a kind of more intercommunal conflict in the north, and the other, as I say, an intra-Republican conflict in the 26 counties. And of course, Dundalk and Louth is absolutely of the sort of hinge of these 2 conflicts. So that's the basic background. On the night of the 17th of June, 1922, an IRA party, relatively small actually, about 20 people, so presumably just in a few cars, leaves Dundalk military barracks and crosses over the new border into Northern Ireland and heads about 5 miles north. At about 2:30 in the morning, they arrive in the townlands of Altnaveigh and Liska, which is just to the west of Newry. And there's then a sort of extraordinarily intense but short series of attacks in which 8 households, all Presbyterian, are attacked. Several people are wounded. 6 people are shot dead, 5 men and 1 woman. Their names are Elizabeth and Thomas Crozier, who are quite elderly, actually. Well, they're sort of late 50s and early 60s, I think. John Heslip and his son, Robert, who's 19, James Lockhart, who's 23, and another young man, Joseph Gray, who's 20. So it's a pretty well worked out operation. It's pretty intense. A lot of bombs are thrown into the houses. They're also kind of set fire to without much warning. But within about an hour or so, it is kind of all over, and the raiders decamp back over the border to Dundalk, leaving landmines behind them to hinder the pursuit. So what are we to make of this grisly incident, and why did it happen? Well, on why did it happen, I'm going to be resplendently banal and disappointing and say we don't know. I mean, there are several competing explanations which aren't necessarily incompatible, but we're really forced into the dark arts of what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz once called long-distance mind reading. You know, we don't know exactly what was in the raiders' minds, or indeed in presumably it being an authorized reprisal in Frank Aitken's mind, he being the commander of the 4th Northern Division based in Dundalk of the IRA. There's really kind of 3 main explanations have emerged. Traditionally, it's been seen as really kind of part of a chain of sort of back and forth attacks involving the Ulster Special Constabulary, the really local militia force that the Northern Irish government had raised, and suspected Republicans, although identification of who really had Republican sympathies and not wasn't always very careful. That goes back at least a year. So there's a kind of chain of relatively small-scale tit-for-tat killings, usually 1 or 2 people. Grisly stuff, but inherently relatively limited, that goes back in the area for about a year or so. And there had indeed been a nasty incident on the Lisleigh Road where 2 men, Thomas Crawley and Patrick Cregan, had been shot by the specials on the 13th of June, so just a couple of nights before, and their bodies had been left in holes on the road that had been dug to bury landmines in. It's worth pointing out that one of the kind of unexpected events of the First World War was a dispersal of the kind of technology of what we now call IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or culvert bombs as they're more traditionally were called in the recent Troubles. And this technology has been kind of adopted by the IRA, and this is causing the specials quite a lot of problems with mobility. So a couple of men are shot, Catholics are shot as apparently some sort of reprisal for this attack. But there's then, this extraordinarily disproportionate attack at Altnaveigh. So one can place it within that chain of events, but it still seems not quite to fit, at least in terms of proportions. It looks odd. There is, however, a sort of auxiliary or parallel, if you like, explanation of another event at Dromantee, about 5 miles or so away, that earlier in the same evening, the same night, I should say, 16th of June, there is an ambush of about a much larger party, about 50 IRA men, under Frank Aitken's direct command, ambush a party of special constables on the road. And they seem to do so in direct revenge to, again, another incident that had happened a couple of nights before, on the 14th of June, 1922, where a bunch of specials had raided a pub owned by a prominent local Republican called McGill. And it seems pretty unambiguous. It's one of the very few documented accounts of really horrific sexual violence on women in the pub committed by the specials. Linda Connolly has done some good work on sexual violence in the Irish Revolution generally, by various factions and various sides. It has made a sort of powerful argument that an awful lot may have been swept under the carpet, which seems to me quite plausible. This is a case where this definitely made the news and made the headlines. So it is possible to advance an explanation, and I was bold enough to try and do this in the book that Tommy was kind enough to mention, Frontiers of Violence, that actually the Altnaveigh killing may be connected to this other event, or other chain of reprisals a few miles away, and that might help explain its kind of scale, that sexual violence, as far as we can see, does seem to have been relatively rarely reported or not made public at the time. So this is a kind of shocking event, and that Altnaveigh, in some ways, even though it's a few miles away, so it's perhaps is an awkward fit, but perhaps is part of that. Doyle Aaron Publicity Bureau makes a sort of claim, I think, along those lines, which is kind of what put the idea in my head. Now, Robert Lynch, the excellent historian he is, who's pushed back on that and suggested that there's two kind of two sets of micro conflicts going on in parallel, and that I'm trying to sort of squash them together in a way that doesn't really work. I leave that to yourselves to thrash out. There's also a third motive that Robert doesn't really mention in his article, which is in the Irish News, the 22nd of June, 1922, where at one of these Presbyterian households, one of the family members asks, the IRA, why are they doing this? Why have they suddenly raided them in the middle of the night? And the answer they get is, quote, "It is being done for the Roman Catholics of Belfast." Now, it's being done for the Roman Catholics of Belfast. I mean, putting this in context, violence was incredibly intense in Belfast in the first half of 1922. 285 people died in 1922 in Belfast, which is the most intense period of killing in the city's history. It's worse than 1972, where 298 people died, but over 12 months, not over 6 months, as in 1922. So things are pretty grim for the Catholic minority in Belfast. They really are having a horrendous time at this point. It is slightly odd phrasing, though, at least to my ears, saying it's being done for the Roman Catholics. That's a kind of Protestant phraseology. The Catholics don't tend to call themselves Roman Catholics, in my experience. That is slightly odd, but may also have been part of the picture. And of course, there may have been various motivations for different members of those the participants involved. So I'm sorry to be sort of so kind of entirely agnostic as to exactly what the drivers and the motivations are here, because I don't think we can settle that one. At least I haven't found the kind of smoking gun evidence that says exactly why it was done. It is striking that Frank Aitken's papers were weeded about this, and so it's actually, it's something that the Republican movement is quite evasive about at the time. They don't kind of really discuss it for perhaps reasons we can come to later. Now, it's not an entirely unprecedented type operation. I think the obvious comparison is actually with the Rosslea area of North Monaghan, South Armagh, in about 15 months earlier, where there was a major raid, much larger, sort of 200 or so IRA men rather than 20, that targets 14 households in a night, and 3 B specials are killed that night. What seems different about Altnaveigh is, the Rosslea attacks were pretty spectacular, but it was also pretty obvious why they'd happened. A month before, a bunch of specials and Orangemen had actually burnt a lot of the Catholic houses in the village following an IRA attack. So there's a kind of very clear tit-for-tat rationale there, and there's no mystery about why the Rosslea attacks happened in March 1921. But June 22 at Altnaveigh feels a bit different. There is the profile of the victims, the fact that one of them was a woman of mature years, which is not your typical victim of IRA attacks at all. There is also the fact that the houses were set fire to without much warning. And it's sort of unclear on this point. And some of the IRA statements and witness statements in the Bureau of Military History that do talk about this sort of say, oh, well, yes, Altnaveigh was a kind of, nest of specials. I mean, it's not clear. I haven't seen any research that shows that it was. Again, the news reports in the Irish News, one of the participants explicitly denies it after saying we had nothing to do with the constabulary in any way. That's the Gray household, So they do seem to be kind of, there seems to be a kind of loosening of targeting. It seems to be more overtly sectarian, if I can call that there. In the common denominator seems to be these are all Presbyterian households. And that's kind of really pretty much what they've got in common. Although there is mostly men who are targeted, that is worth pointing out. So it's generally taken as a kind of pretty as if we think of sectarian violence as a spectrum, which I think is often a more helpful way of seeing it, it's kind of more down the clearer end of the targeting being on that principle. Now, it's also often taken as a kind of archetype. It's a kind of striking feature of the 1920s Troubles that the kind of worst incidents, the Weaver Street bomb of February 1922 in Belfast, the McMahon murders of March 1922, about which I've written again in Belfast, and Altnaveigh, are sort of taken as kind of archetypes, which is odd because they're actually fairly aberrational incidents. They go against the run of play, both in, particularly in their scale, the number of people involved. I mean, one Northern Irish government police report afterwards thought that maybe that if the raiders had been a bit more careful, they might have killed up to 30 people. They were so sort of reckless in tossing hand grenades around and that sort of thing. So, the scale is clearly unusual. And I think the sort of point I want to make, though, is, if we do see these attacks as aberrational, we also have to see them as illustrating a wider landscape of possibilities, which is probably one reason why they are so notorious and so remembered. And, that landscape, dark landscape of possibilities is really of something that I might kind of loosely call a kind of more Balkan or Bosnian type meltdown in intercommunal relations. And if that sounds a little kind of over the top or lurid, it's worth just going back slightly further to the Third Home Rule crisis of a few years earlier. Here is the Spectator, so a sort of Tory English newspaper, the 1st of November 1913. I hope you'll bear with me if I just read you an extract. This is what the Spectator thought might happen in the 1st of November 1913. I think it's kind of interesting comparator to actually sort of measure against what did actually happen nearly 8 years later. So this is what the Spectator says. If a Home Rule bill is passed, is basically the context, quote, there will be in all of the Protestant centres a movement to drive away the Catholics. They will not be massacred, but do what the leaders will. The Protestant workmen and the Protestant majorities in the towns and populous areas will not consent to live with a Catholic and nationalist population beside them. Fear and panic will have their usual effect. They make men cruel and ruthless. Protestants will argue that if they cannot feel safe when they take the field in their regiments, if their homes are left at the mercy of the Catholic minority, that minority will accordingly be expelled, or at any rate an attempt will be made to expel them as traitors within the citadel. The Catholics will naturally resist, appeal for protection from the government, and so the fight will begin. Next will come reprisals from the south and west, and still more in places on the Ulster border, where the Catholics are in a majority, where they will very naturally say they have to mete out to the Protestants the treatment meted out to them already. They will endeavour in fine to drive out the Protestants. The fact that the Ulster Civil War will begin in this way will make it very difficult for the government to do what is always wise in case of civil trouble, to keep their forces concentrated. The military command will be overwhelmed with demands to send troops here, there and everywhere to prevent what will be called, quote, massacres, and which, as blood becomes hotter, will almost deserve that description. So, I mean, I could go on and give you more of the same. I mean, there's a couple of sort of interesting points, I think, from that. One, this kind of spectators peering into the future kind of assumes two things that didn't happen, that the military is going to be mostly moving by horse, whereas, of course, within 8 years after World War I, it's lorries and motorised transport have totally changed that in ways that clearly weren't foreseen in 1913. And secondly, it sort of assumes that the British military is going to be sort of entirely stretched and sort of unable to cope. There's a sort of almost a vision of kind of state collapse that didn't, I think, really happen. It's worth pointing out in November 1913 that, the Balkan Wars were in full swing, and that may be the sort of image in the background. But there are also, I think, some points that seem quite prescient. I think the way in which the outbreaks of violence are foreseen in urban centres, attacks on Catholic workmen, I think is quite prescient. That is kind of what happened in the summer of 1920. And then this kind of tit-for-tat dynamic on the border. And I think, the fact that this danger had been foreseen in the Third Home Rule crisis, and one could find other examples, this is kind of just one article I could give you, I think raises interesting questions, because it suggests to me that, if this kind of set-piece horror show that Altnaveigh was could be something like it could be foreseen, why did things like this not happen more often? Why were there not more Altnaveighs? What was the limits on this type of sectarian targeting? And of course, this is essentially speculative. It's not an exact science trying to explain why things didn't happen. That's always difficult. I've already nodded to the wider context. If the 26 counties hadn't had their civil war, would things have carried on heating up on the border on the same kind of trajectory? Could there have been more Altnaveighs? Yes, quite possibly. But beyond kind of the vagaries of contingency and timing, I think it is worth thinking about, okay, what then are the limits on this type of sectarian violence? Why is there not more of it? So just a couple of thoughts on that. I think ideas and ideology do matter. I think we have to take Republican restraint seriously. I think in basic terms, the IRA could have killed a hell of a lot more Protestant civilians than they did. But that restraint is not total. As Altnaveigh showed, it could fray, it could break down. And it's those moments that I think are truly terrifying. They are like King's Mill in 1976. Moments when the Republican movement, often it seems at sort of moments of particularly low morale, seem to kind of respond in kind to loyalist provocations, really kind of creates the spectre of a horrendous cycle of violence that is essentially unstoppable or potentially unstoppable, and that involves potentially everyone, because no one is safe from it. cycles of violence are not meaningless as they look to outsiders. They're kind of they're not unending because they're meaningless. They're more that they impose kind of meanings and choices on everyone, regardless of their own personal preferences or tolerance or whatever. I think, though, we also need to kind of look at political unionism, as that article in the Spectator, interestingly, from a Tory newspaper, kind of, suggested in November 1913. There is a kind of supremacist loyalist wing that, did kind of lead the shipyard expulsions and some of the kind of the attacks in towns in the summer of 1920 that I do think do have some of the qualities of pogroms. It's been a term that historians have not tended to use, but I think that it has some limited applicability to some of the violence. But, unionism was not fascism. If you look at, what Mussolini was up to, the March on Rome, just about this time, or a couple of months later, rather, it's clear that sort of political unionism, the elite unionist indulgence of its supremacist wing can certainly be criticised for cowardice and for not sort of reining in elements on the grassroots. But they never really developed a sort of cult or a violence in the same way. There are some resemblances, I think, to sort of unionist rallies in 1914 with the sort of, Carson as a sort of proto-fascist figure, if you like. But I do think there are limits on this and we shouldn't push it too far. So, I think ideas and ideology are part of the reason why the drift into this kind of sectarian civil war is retarded. But, the world is full of plenty of examples where civil wars developed their own momentum and got out of hand, regardless of any master plan or intention of the elite actors. So I think we need to look at other factors too. I think an obvious one is neighborliness in rural areas. That's kind of clear from, the tragic last words of Eliza Crozier just before she was shot, saying, I did not expect this from you, Willie. She clearly knew one of the attackers, which I think is, interesting and suggestive in its own right. And it's clearly not how they expected to be treated from their neighbours. And that, clearly was wrong in this case, but it probably most of the time was actually right, that, there were, that sort of neighbourliness did actually kind of act as a retarding force. I think too, these positive forces can also be sort of mixed in with more negative ones of deterrence. There's a fascinating comment in the Bureau of Military History, Witness Statement 634, Jack McAlaw, who's IRA activist at the time. He gives a very, very vivid picture of what the atmosphere was like after the Altnaveigh shootings. This is what he says, that the fear inspired, quote, the fear inspired by Altnaveigh and what had gone before was not confined to any party or section of the community. All were afraid of what was to come next. In neighbouring districts around Newry, Bessbrook and Altnaveigh, all of the male civilian population evacuated their houses at night and slept out in the fields. This state of affairs soon produced strange bedfellows. For the nationalists, which included Hibernians and Republicans, and the Unionists and Orangemen, went together in many instances for company when sleeping out and promised each other protection. So, there's a sort of interesting kind of neighbourliness there that is actually kind of based upon an acceptance of a sectarian divide that is, not really challenged. It's kind of seen as something that you work with, not that you try and transcend. And I think it's also kind of very telling, evocative description of this kind of atmosphere of total fear in the aftermath of Altnaveigh. Just as an aside, I think historians and social scientists generally, political scientists, we don't really talk enough about atmosphere. We leave atmosphere to the poets and to the journalists. But, if we define atmosphere as the climate of intersubjective expectations as to what's going to happen next, within which all public business must be transacted, then it's pretty clear it has an atmosphere on mass behaviour. And I think that's what we are seeing here. So, I think we do need to kind of perhaps also pay some attention against these sort of fragile standoffs. That witness statement I just read then goes on to say, but it kind of taught the Unionists or taught the specials that a good lesson, and they sort of started behaving themselves and treating people better afterwards, which is kind of interestingly sort of unapologetic, really. So, there is a sort of deterrence has to be constantly maintained, and is a fragile piece. It's a kind of Cold War. So, it's, again, an inherently fragile way of trying to maintain stability. But, I think it is a sort of big, unexplored subtext to both the Third Home Rule crisis and this period, the local arrangements that stopped things getting worse. Because there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that there were such tacit or sometimes explicit understandings between B specials and the IRA or whatever, just to keep districts quiet. Okay, I think I'm was going to move on to another feature that I see in someone in the chat has anticipated, which is exactly, I'm very conscious of my English accent here, the role of the British government. Yes, I was coming on to that. I mean, I think what is striking to me is how layered and stratified a conflict this is, that there are different conflicts and different axes of confrontation playing out that sometimes barely seem to intersect or even barely seem to be connected. So, the sort of key structuring feature of a lot of these events is to borrow a phrase about the recent Brexit crisis, a sort of wonderful phrase, and I can't remember who said it, but it was basically saying, that London's priority was the maintenance of indifference with a clear conscience. In other words, they didn't want to think about this place, they didn't want to deal with it, and they wanted to keep it at arm's length as much as they could, and they were actually prepared to pay really quite a lot of money and subsidies, especially to the Ulster Special Constabulary, that cost 2.7 million in 1922-3, to keep it at arm's length. So the weird thing, or the striking thing to me, is that Ireland fractures down county lines. The partition follows these county lines largely because that kind of suits the convenience of British politicians. Herbert Asquith in the Third Home Rule crisis, complained about the infernal snippets. In other words, these pockets of population that are in the wrong way. It sort of suited the British politicians to kind of think in county lines, because anything else was. I mean, admittedly, there weren't other good choices. I'm not saying there were, but. It is essentially a kind of structure that is decided in London, even if the problem it's trying to solve is on the ground in the north of Ireland. So, the border doesn't necessarily matter for how life was lived, particularly on a micro level, or how trade worked and so on, but it mattered because Westminster thought it mattered. And therefore, even in June 1922, when one might think the border hadn't really been reified, hadn't really become that significant, you have this extraordinary phenomenon of people moving a couple of miles, sometimes up to 5 miles from their homes when tensions are really high, to go and sleep in the Free State, because that's the border does matter. Even that early, it matters. And I think that sort of brings me on to a sort of wider reflection that this is a conflict that is happening in a really quite striking and idiosyncratic macro context. That, very often Irish partition, the creation of the border, is seen as part of a wider process of states downsizing, splitting up after the First World War. And I'm guilty of that. My doctoral thesis and first book was very much looking at the world that way. I wonder, though, whether we are in some danger of pushing that. The main point is the British state had not collapsed. This was a victorious power, and Britain had lost 261 soldiers in Ireland from 1919 to 21. But had lost 702,000 military fatalities between 1914 and 18. The British state was not going to be bled dry or bled white in the back lanes of West Cork or wherever Tom Barry staged some pretty professional ambushes. But it sort of voluntarily tried to push the problem away by creating Northern Ireland. And this is different, and they say it then followed the convenience of county lines. This is different from, say, areas that I've also looked at a little bit, of, say, the German-Polish borderlands. If one looks at Wielka Polska or Greater Poland, the old German Grand Duchy of Posen, there's a fascinating sort of parallel there that, if anyone is with the right language skills wants to do a PhD or something on that, I would, really recommend. If you look at this area of what was then, before World War I, Eastern Germany, you have a kind of really pretty, I would argue, comparable, deeply divided society. You have a population of Catholic Poles and Protestant Germans, so there's also a small Jewish minority, of course. But, it kind of bears all of the hallmarks of a very deeply divided society. So 1911 to 12 census, 98.5% of all new Polish husbands choose Polish wives. There's next to no intermarriage across the communal divide. The 1912 Reichstag elections, 93% of all Polish voters who are eligible vote for Polish national candidates. And it's the same on the German side. They vote for German parties. So politics, marriage, whatever, it kind of looks pretty clean, pretty deeply divided society. Now, what happens at the end of World War I? Well, there is a revolt, breaks out, something a little bit like the sort of Dublin, the Easter Rising in 1916, happens in the sort of end of December 1918. The fighting goes on for a few weeks, and basically the Polish nationalist movement takes most of Poznań, most of Posen, and it becomes part of the new Polish state. But it's essentially a military solution. What they hold on the battlefield is what becomes Polish, and the small outer rim of what's left of the Grand Duchy of Posen that the sort of German volunteer forces hold, does stay in the Weimar Republic of Germany. So it's a military solution. It's a bit like the borders of Israel in 1948. It is entirely decided on the battlefield. And what seems to me so striking about Irish partition is this is not the case. The IRA can pull off an Altnaveigh. They can apparently, at least according to their activists, sort of win what would seem to be kind of a kind of competition, if you like, an auction of rival sort of attacks or attempts at intimidation. They can, as one of the witness statements, makes absolutely clear, intimidate witnesses. The Grey family, after Altnaveigh, in years afterwards, they sort of tried to bring charges. They thought they knew who some of these attackers were, and they were basically intimidated out of it. The witness statements make quite clear. So they could sort of control stuff on at the local level, but they couldn't shift the border 1 inch north. It stayed where it was. And this is kind of very similar to, again, a sort of local study I've done of the Rosslea area where, the Republican movement stays strong, kind of controls things on the ground to a large degree. But, as I say, at a macro level, the British state kind of remains above the fray as much as it can. Of course, it's intrinsically involved. There's serious military forces in the background that get called out if need be. There's some sort of cross-border skirmishes at Jonesborough, and more famously at Balik and Petago on the Donegal border, and so on. So the military is always there in the background. It's basically the English taxpayer who's paying for most of this. They're trying to stay as much in the background, and I think this does put some emphasis on really one of the areas of London's culpability, which is the kind of process of what in the 1970s was called Ulsterization, but is clearly there in the autumn of 1920, which is raising the Ulster Special Constabulary, which is still an extraordinary experiment to basically subcontract out law and order to a volunteer police force without much training, or so paramilitary force, effectively. And it's I think in hindsight, one can see this isn't good for unionism either. This kind of basically militarizes or paramilitarizes the conflict. I think it sectarianizes, it spreads it, and it brings in, all kinds of individuals and communities in ways who wouldn't necessarily have been so directly drawn into a Republican insurgency against British Crown forces otherwise. But we don't really know much about that side of it. I think excellent historians like Caoimhe Nick Garvade at Sheffield is trying, I think, to get some of these kind of Ulster Special Constabulary records in Prony, Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, opened up. But it's really important to sort of stress that we don't have a kind of an equivalent of the Bureau of Military History or the Military Service Pensions Collections or whatever for the at least we don't at the moment. We don't have an open version of this for the specials, and probably the records are not going to be that rich as the various initiatives that were taken south of the border in the decades after this conflict. But we don't really have much access to anything at the moment, and so we don't really kind of know much about their perspectives apart from anecdotally what we can pick up from a couple of memoirs. And I think that is very important, because we don't know that much really about, at one level, about how, say, the B specials actually worked. I mean, there was a lot of them. There's 19,000 of them. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Ulster Special Constabulary was kind of split into 3 sections: A, B, and C specials. A were full-time and paid, B were volunteer and part-time, and C's were, frankly, headbangers who were kind of called, well, some of them were headbangers. I shouldn't say that about all of them. That's a terrible slander. But they were the less reliable elements who were called out if need be. The thing about the B specials is that, I mean, it's not at all clear how much they're in uniform. It's a question that isn't often asked, but they seem to have their uniforms by 22. But for a lot of the conflict, even then, are they wearing them all the time? I mean, is it always easy to tell when you kind of stopped on a country lane? Are these legitimate B specials, or are they kind of freelance loyalists? It's kind of very basic question, but it seems to me, actually rather important for understanding how close this came to becoming a sort of all-out intercommunal sectarian war. And of course, it's also important, as feminist scholars absolutely rightly remind us, to point out the often invisible labour of women, that these B special patrols and so on and so forth, being fed by someone somewhere. So there's all kinds of wider communities are involved in different ways as well. But we don't know, as I say, that much really about how the B specials worked with the kind of degree of sensitivity that we can do for the IRA. I mean, it seems to me a fairly obvious point that they are a very decentralized force, and a lot must have depended upon local commanders and how they handled their men. But that point is, rarely made. I do also think that, the B specials have, of course, a notorious reputation, particularly amongst the Catholic community, and one can understand why, because of some horrendous incidents that happened. But we perhaps have let the A specials off the hook too much. It seems to me quite significant that there's about 5,500 of them by the midsummer of 1922, and they're really doing the work of the RUC, which is still kind of embryonic at this stage. And it is A specials who commit the sexual assaults at Dronty. It is the A specials who are then ambushed a couple of days later, and they're men from Belfast. That's clear from the victims. So I sense, I can't prove this, but I sense that there's actually a way in which Belfast is the epicenter of this conflict, and that taking A specials from Belfast and taking them down to the border is not helping communal relations at all. It's actually kind of helping spread some of these tensions. It's a point that you often get from activists and Republican prisoners, that you go to Belfast and the atmosphere is entirely different. Yeah, there's tensions in the countryside down in Fermanagh or wherever, but as Cathy Healy talks about this quite eloquently. But when you get to Belfast, it's an absolutely different atmosphere, which I think is still the case in the modern Troubles. People might say, might offer similar observations. So actually taking a bunch of urban A specials, as seems to be happening, and then ferrying them around the South Armagh border doesn't seem to me a kind of recipe for stability. It's also worth pointing out on the excellent work by Robert Lynch of just the number of people that are on the move at this time. The number of refugees is extraordinary. Dundalk is full of them. And he estimates, there's maybe about 50 or 80,000 refugees, which is pretty significant. And, how have we missed this? Well, I think we've missed it because most of them did go home relatively shortly. Because, as I say, the general context is not one of state collapse. Britain is a victorious power, unlike the defeated Germany after World War I. And so, to a large degree, both north of the border as a sort of Northern Ireland staying part of the United Kingdom, and also in the Free State. I mean, I don't want to downplay the Civil War, which is the Munster Republic, and ends in kind of horrible atrocities in 23, of course. But to answer the question in the chat is the Free State government gets going and up and running to some degree quicker than one might expect. So there isn't this kind of total Balkan style meltdown, or say even German Polish type meltdown that one gets at the end of World War I. the sort of meltdown that was kind of foreseen in 1913, the widening gyre of my title, my sort of a pretentious borrowing of the phrase from the Yeats poem, this kind of sense of a spiral getting out of control. There are limits. So, trying to sum up the series of reflections, I think we do need to look at that kind of macro state context. We need to look at the complexity and the intricacy of intercommunal / sectarian relations on the ground. We need to take sectarian violence seriously as a phenomenon in its own right, rather than just seeing it rather patronizingly as kind of atavistic hatreds. And I think, hopefully that kind of approach might help us dig a little bit deeper into why sort of nightmarish episodes, as the Altnaveigh killings clearly were, could be treated as one-offs. They are the kind of rare moments when the Republican movement looks like it's going to get drawn into a sort of tit-for-tat cycle that is, clearly horrific for everyone. And unfortunately, things don't go further. They briefly look like this might be the shape of things to come. Thank goodness it wasn't. Okay, sectarianism is an inherently grim subject, as some of the comments in the chat said before I got launched. I feel that I've preached on it quite long enough. I've tested your patience quite long enough, so I shall leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. When you were talking there, I thought of another slightly pretentious quotation, which is the kipling. We know the war prepared on every peaceful home. We know the hell's declared for such as serve not Rome. And it was interesting. I thought that the Spectator seems to be at least slightly prepared to accept that it was a two-sided problem in the way the kipling wasn't.
Yes, indeed. I think I find those kind of lurid projections that you get in sort of 1913, 1914, when the sort of some of the kind of Tory Unionist press kind of loses it a bit. I actually, that particular Spectator article is reproduced in a Johnson book, A Civil War in Ulster, which is, basically as an appendix, as a kind of dismissive, this is kind of ridiculous stuff, isn't it? I actually think it's kind of, it's not right, but it's a more lucid, I think, projection forward than, say, Kipling and many others. But they're worth revisiting because they kind of give us a window into the past's possible futures, the sort of the things that some people, from whatever their political perspective and values, thought might happen, against which then to measure reality.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just on the border, actually, and since we've gone back in time to 1913, it's interesting to note that John Redmond, who is often genuflected towards these days in various commemoration and state-run events, described moving away from the county lines as totally unworkable in his papers. I think it's the papers connected with the Buckingham Palace Conference of 1914. So there was a suggestion that Newry might be split off from the rest of Armagh down and moved into any home rule area. And
sure, that's fascinating. It just points out we, so lacking a decent biography of Redmond. Despite the great work Alvin Jackson's done or whatever, which is kind of extraordinary, because you say he has been certainly determined attempts to rehabilitate. Well, there's always the later Redmond. It's never the sort of campaigner for the kind of Fenian dynamiters in the 1890s or whatever. That is interesting. And in fairness, there is a kind of point that when what are you going to go for? Are you going to go for sort of poor law unions or whatever the kind of other local units of government are going to be? It's not going to be neat at all. But I think there's still something to the fact that particularly British politicians in Asquith just couldn't be asked. It's just too much hassle, just get their heads around it. And that I may be kind of jumping a century in a cavalier fashion, but there's kind of something horribly contemporary about that. It's all just too complex to think about from London's point of view.
Yeah, just to get back to Ethan's question there, I think it might be worth drawing out again the point about in terms of how the Irish government responded. It's worth drawing out again the two points, I think, which I'll ask you to comment on. One, the Dáil Publicity Bureau's statement of a couple of days later. And two, the fact that obviously this was IRA activity. And by the 1930s, when pensions are being distributed to former members of the anti-treaty IRA, this is mentioned in government papers in the Department of Defense as an IRA activity for which members of the IRA could legitimately claim pensionable service?
Excuse me. Just a couple of reactions to that. Yes, I mean, it's, Aiken seems to weed his papers, but it's never sort of disavowed. And I had sort of, reading the excellent work that's come out in the last 10 years on this, which, and I have looked at the McMahon murders in Belfast in I think a fair amount of detail. I've never done Altnaveigh to the same degree, so I'm kind of indebted to those who have done the kind of archival legwork. I did wonder, is there a kind of, given the pressures on that unit at the time, is this kind of fraying discipline? I mean, I've never seen that said or used as kind of excuse, but I suppose I'm kind of thinking of a kind of Kingsmill type analogy of the kind of provost at a low ebb in 76, a sort of sense of, his discipline fraying. It's a very small group. It was 20 people. It's to do what they did is incredibly intense. And that made me wonder whether it's more of a breakaway. But I don't know, and I haven't seen that alleged, so I wouldn't want to push that. As for the comment in the chat about 2 extensive volumes on Redmond, Dermot, Milady, well, I thank you. I hold my hands up. It's about 10 years since I taught this stuff, so clearly I need to go looking back at the literature. Thank you for that tip-off.
Yeah, I think the other point, I think just on your point on the small group, I think that's something we often see, though, in IRA activity throughout the period, in that there's often quite what a modern military would call a tooth-to-tail ratio. There's quite a lot of people in the background and people doing minimal enough things. And, for many IRA members, the War of Independence consisted of a couple of nights they went out and chopped down trees to block the road to prevent an intervention from the Crown Forces on something that other people were doing a few miles away. So I in some ways, in terms of some of the stuff that I've studied, I think actually 20 is quite a lot of IRA men compared to, say, some of the small activities you see around the place.
I suppose I was just thinking of Rosslea, which seems to be kind of over. I mean, they hit 14 houses, and there's sort of 8 or 10 men in each raiding party. It's big, That's and the same night that there's 50 at the Dromtea ambush. So that's what I was thinking of. But you're right. I mean, it's not against the wider landscape. It's probably not that atypical.
Yeah, I mean, the just to come back to the question we've here, fascinating about the idea of the border never moving an inch. When you think about it, how did it not naturally develop areas of Republican dominance where the British were forced to relinquish, which ultimately would shrink the border? I mean, my own thoughts on that would probably be the two things. One, the military balance with the British, where in effect, if where there's a British will to dominate the space, there's very little break on them doing so, particularly in the northern part of the country. And also then the Civil War probably really cuts the legs off any armed Republican resistance in the 6 counties as 1922 goes on. I don't know what you make of those two explanations.
I think I'd be horribly consensual and probably agree warmly. No, I think so. I think the military, this is kind of my point about, 261, there are obviously police as well, but the 261, British soldiers killed in Ireland, 1919 to 21, against 702,000 in World War I. I mean, it just wasn't... The pressures on London are political, and I mean, this has been well explored, Ronan Fanning and people. But if you got Lloyd George as Prime Minister presiding over a coalition government as a Liberal, as the firebrand who'd criticised concentration camps in the Boer War 20 years earlier, it's kind of embarrassing if he gets pushed into kind of similar tactics. But it could have been done. There was there was the muscle there were the resources to do it, of course. But it's more a kind of political embarrassment. So I think from that point of view, it's clear that when push comes to shove, Petago-Balik salient, when that actually happens, when the Republicans have actually basically thrown out the British state and taken that territory, well, then you actually show what you've got in reserve, and it's kind of over fairly quickly. But I think to me the sort of counterfactual, which sort of I've obstinately kind of pushed, and I don't know that anyone has been at all interested in, was an article I wrote about 5 years ago on why do the loyalists in North Monaghan not try and hold on to territory the same way? Basically this point about could there have been facts on the ground? I mean, we do tend to look at, naturally, understandably influenced by the subsequent history of the late 20th century, we do tend to look at the Republican areas where that, there's a kind of attempt basically to do kind of West Cork tactics of the 20s. But what about the other way? What about loyalists holding on to the UVF holding on to territory? And to my own satisfaction, anyway, I thought there was more UVF activity up until early 21 in North Monaghan that suddenly stops, which I think is to do with the kind of essentially a tit for tat cycle that the IRA do win hands down over Rosslea. But of course, the Civil War in the South is crucial too. Just thinking about Paddy's excellent question here about
It does. I'll read that out while you think, Tim. Just Paddy Morrow from Monaghan has just asked us a question. Just wondering, does the severity of Altnaveigh give a false impression of the overall situation in South Armagh? The general view is the IRA got the upper hand in the area, but up to the truce, there was nearly twice as many IRA fatalities as Crown forces in South Armagh. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily look at it in that way in terms of fatalities, Paddy. I would say just in terms of my own study of the War of Independence, because any military force who's on the offensive will concede a certain amount of casualties. So if the IRA are able to harm the Crown forces and the Crown forces decide that discretion is the better part of valor and they stay in their barracks, then they can cede control to the Republicans. And also in South Armagh at that stage, Sinn Féin had won the election in 1920. But what do you think overall, Tim? It should be pointed out that I was going to say something else as well in terms of the War of Independence, based on what you said about that prior to this, these killings at Altnaveigh in 1922, there had been trouble, tit-for-tat violence for the previous 12 months. And I think that comes back to something that I think is poorly understood about the War of Independence in Ireland, is that although it's often dated from January 1919, it really is only much more intense from about February of 1921, and more than half the people who die in that period. And then on top of that, you have the situation in May and June 1921, where, as well as increasing fatalities, the IRA start doing a large number of small jobs. So there's disruption on the ground in places in Ireland in June 1921 that had been very quiet during much of the rest of the War of Independence. So just having given that backdrop, what do you think of Paddy's question?
I mean, like all good provocative questions, it sort of stopped and made me think. I mean, I suppose I don't get the impression in June 22. I mean, Kieran Glenman's excellent work has kind of showed, the fatalities kind of dropping off in June. I mean, it is true that this particular corner of the border is perhaps not entirely, isn't really in step with other areas, but it just doesn't look to me like the loyalists have their tails up. I mean, the ace specials who raid the pub in Drummondtee who are disguised and drunk, and it just seems really ill-disciplined, and these are meant to be the kind of professionals. It just doesn't look like a very confident force to me. I think something I hadn't really thought about until I wrote a recent book with the cheerful title of Killing Strangers was and because I've sort of not moved away from studying Ireland, I haven't, but I've developed other interests as well. And one of them is the sort of transference or lack of it from the battlefield to political violence. And, one of the things that's really striking about this period compared to UVF mobilizations and so on, the Third Home Rule or the Fenians in 1867 is the emphasis on landmines. There does seem to be, it's a bit like sniping in the back streets of Belfast. There does seem to be ways in which there is a definite knock-on effect of kind of the sort of repertoire of insurgent violence is different and does seem to be kind of borrowing from the kind of from the Western Front. So, from that point of view, I think they are actually causing quite a lot of problems for mobility. I mean, this kind of, shooting a couple of Republicans, but not IRA members, and sort of leaving them provocatively in sites of attempted landmine attacks seems to be sending some sort of message that they're actually kind of struggling with this.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting as well that two historians of the period, Peter Hart and W.H. Cout, have commented on the fact that the IRA developed these landmines, again, quite late in the conflict, or are late to us because we know the conflict finishes in early July 1921. But as the IRA developed landmines at that point, it's probably a significant development. In fact, it's probably a much more significant development than the much more famous Thompson gun importation, which fails because the FBI bust them in Hoboken in New Jersey.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that does. Thing I read from the Spectator, it's the bit I kind of missed out was kind of talking, well, the British cavalry will be kind of stretched, or the UVF cavalry will be stretched left, right, and centre. And it kind of jolted me. You think, less than 10 years later, they're all in lorries, but that clearly hadn't been foreseen. So the sort of motorisation of transport and mobility is clearly a major part of it, and it does seem. I think landmines are having really quite an effect on, presumably, on morale, and they're pretty powerful weapon, I'd have thought, potentially. Kieran making the point that the IRA was already a beaten docket, which is, point well made in your book, Kieran, excellently made. This corner of Louth, South Armagh, though, seems to be sort of on a different rhythm. It doesn't seem to be syncopated, and things seem to be sort of heating up here in June. And I'm not. I mean, the counterfactual is, were they beaten for good, or is it a lull they could have come back from? How does one know? Well, how can one know?
Yeah, I think we maybe didn't develop the point you raised about your other article in Roy Foster's Festschrift, I think it was, about the loyalists in Monaghan. I wonder to what extent is that just geographically determined? I mean, is it actually determined by what you've just described in terms of South Armagh being on its own sort of arc, and that the loyalists in Monaghan are to a degree cut off from by the fact of South Armagh and to a degree East Tyrone. The loyalists in Monaghan aren't really contiguous to a kind of a loyalist hinterland, and does that just psychologically, as much as anything, prevent them from acting or restrain their actions?
I think that's a large part of it. I mean, even in North Monaghan, they're not that well distributed really for resistance, but they still, February 1921, they can still turn up in large numbers and help burn Rosslea. Specials come down from Enniskillen, but there's a large contingent from the Monaghan side of the border. This is the kind of point I kept trying to emphasise, and that again goes back to. What do we mean when we say B-men or B-specials? A lot of the kind of Republican accounts and the memoirs, the Marin papers or whatever in Monaghan talks about B-men. And there's a little part of me is actually really slightly skeptical. Do they mean B-specials in Monaghan, or is it just a blanket term for loyalists? And if guys are wandering around with an armband at this stage at most, why shouldn't there be confusion as to who is in what formation? It doesn't seem very regularized at that time. But my sense is that there's more loyalist activity there. And the other thing I'd say is, some of there's definitely more attacks up to that point. And, I think we've been a little too fetishistic about UVF rifles, which, all get collected in a furniture van. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them get collected in a furniture van in whatever it is, 1917, I think it is, or is it 1918? I can't remember. But, it goes around and picks them all up and says, oh, well, they haven't got their guns now. Well, not all of them have been given up, and they still have handguns, which are actually a lot more useful for some of the stuff they're trying to do. So, I think we've been a little bit literalist about that, but it's just a kind of unwritten history. What I would love to see, and I don't know if anyone's done it, would be sort of, Lagan Valley, East Donegal, where there really is a concentration there. I mean, how do they actually put up more of a fight there, or do they just fold?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was looking at the election result earlier in Lagan Valley for 1918, and the Unionist candidate gets 40% in the East Donegal constituency in 1918, which is, one of the highest south of the border. Not quite as high as Rathmines in Dublin, near where I'm sitting. We should note. Just in relation to Brian Hanley's point here, the willingness of IRA volunteers to mention involvement, despite mixed feelings, is in marked contrast to the silence over the killings in Dunmanway. I mean, what do you think of that? Does that speak maybe to better communal relations in Cork, as in the IRA men in Cork feel a sense of guilt that maybe isn't there for the IRA men in South Armagh and South Down?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's a good point from Brian, of course. same time, there's an awful lot of IRA statements from South Armagh or Louth that kind of just don't mention it. I mean, or that rather that sort of interesting book collection of documents on the Fourth Northerners, is it called? I think it's Gregory Knipe, is it? That came out. Yeah, exactly that one. That he has some sort of reproductions of situation reports where kind of Altnaveigh is barely mentioned or nodded at, or special operation at or something, and it's just really clearly evasive. So I think both in the memoirs and some of the contemporary accounts, there's clearly the willingness is uneven, I think is the way I'd put it in terms of the willingness to mention it.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know if anyone's analysed it, but I wonder, is that uneven willingness come back to your point about neighborliness and restraint? I mean, do neighbours feel more guilty maybe than men from elsewhere? I mean, one thing that always strikes me when we talk about neighborliness and local conflicts like this is the fact in the Spanish Civil War, when they start burning churches, and you get the phenomenon of neighboring anarchists or socialists from neighboring villages essentially burning each other's churches as a favor because they don't want to burn the local church.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, the thing that's kind of toxic about Rosslea is this point that the IRA raiding parties are guided by the sort of stable boys or young Catholics who work for these Protestant strong farmers or whatever you want to kind of call them, which is, it's not an excuse for kind of James Craig's comment in the 30s or whatever about, Protestant jobs for Protestant, whatever he says, Protestant boys and girls or whatever, but lasses and lads, I can't remember how he puts it, but there is a kind of comment in a manner in the border areas. I did just find myself wondering, is that what's in the back of people's minds? Is that what he's kind of appealing to? So, one doesn't sort of overdo neighborliness, I guess, but there's certainly a sense of shock in those comments. I found myself wondering about Altnaveigh, and I didn't really say this tonight, but I did find myself wondering about do we categorize some of these incidents on contingencies? If they hadn't shot Eliza Crozier, if they hadn't shot a woman. But, at Rosslea, I think one woman who tries to save her husband, Samuel Nixon, gets shot in the finger or something. So, we shouldn't read back maybe always so literally from the vagaries of who actually gets injured and survives and who doesn't, what the intentions were. Robert Lynch does make a powerful point that Altnaveigh is pretty reckless, and they really don't seem to be sort of trying to minimise casualties. One of the shootings seems to be kind of relatively spontaneous. There's some young guy tries to talk to his mother and just gets shot for, quote, disobeying orders or something. It sounds kind of like spur at the moment, but I don't know. But you do, I find myself wondering if they hadn't shot Eliza Crozier or something, and maybe one of the other shootings hadn't happened, would it have been as notorious or obviously branded as sectarian? It seems to be it does seem to be at one end of a spectrum, which is why I kind of wanted to introduce the idea of a spectrum of sectarian violence rather than, seems to be this tendency and temptation to constantly put sectarian violence in a box. It's purely sectarian, it's nakedly sectarian. So put a boundary around it and say, this is that category and it's distinct from everything else. I'm less sure about that, but I don't know. I'm speculating wildly here, but is it possible to imagine Altnaveigh going slightly differently and just not becoming notorious, becoming a relatively large-scale reprisal, but not this kind of standout moment? But then, going back to that witness statement about people sleeping out in the fields and trying to protect each other, which again, you get exactly the same thing in Rosslea. There's just kind of atmosphere of oppressive dread on everyone. That doesn't seem to be how contemporaries interpreted it. They do seem to have interpreted it as something different. I don't know. As I say,
I mean, does that? I think that maybe possibly links in with your other point about atmosphere, and maybe something that struck me doing the reading, both of your own work and of the work that's been published since. I mean, you've just mentioned the guy there who's shot for disobeying orders. I mean, does that speak to the kind of escalation of violence and the sense of a kind of a cumulative escalation? Because to some degree, I mean, I'm almost going to go more into the counterfactual and then come back. Does that happen because in the mind of the IRA man, I'm really serious about this because I'm annoyed about Mrs. McGuill, because I'm annoyed about the two lads being shot in Uri yesterday, whose funeral has just happened, that afternoon, or that afternoon in Dundalk. And now this is getting deeply into the counterfactual. But if there had been less provocation to start this, and they just gone on a raid to Altnaveigh for some other reason, maybe if someone disobeyed orders, they would have just given them a slap and said, "Okay, don't do that again." Whereas because of the level of annoyance isn't a strong enough word, but I think it conveys my meaning pretty well. Because of the level of what they felt was provocation, did they feel that is that why we're seeing things like somebody being shot for disobeying orders? Because of the atmosphere of particularly the two, say, what would be seen as the 2-piece specials activities in Drummond T and Newry the previous day, or in the previous week.
Quite possibly. And this goes back to my sort of, let's just say, kind of spectacular agnosticism. Actually, it's long distance mind reading. We don't know what was in their minds or what balance and motivations in their mind. I do wonder slightly, and this is a kind of confession of a repentant sinner, not a confession of a repentant sinner, but perhaps a slight backing off my original kind of approach. And both myself and Robert Lynch kind of got into this kind of micro-sociology of chains of local kind of neighborhood provocations and reprisals. Peter Hart arguably sort of also talked about that, and seeing some of the comments in the chat of people who looked at the records, some things I haven't seen, and all respect to that kind of micro detail, which I think it can be enormously rich, and I'm very drawn to. But I suppose I have just been sort of thinking recently, well, they did have newspapers, and people did, it is a modern conflict, and people do have big horizons. So that odd comment about it's for the Roman Catholics of Belfast, I mean, the Roman bit just doesn't sit right with me. That doesn't seem to me that's what an IRA member would say, but maybe I'm wrong. But even if you take that out, I mean, that it's quite possible that Belfast could have been in people's minds. But one thinks about the A Specials shooting in Cushendall in 23rd of June. It's just a couple of days later. In what is a weird incident, because the Glens are so quiet, and then suddenly there's this rampage. And one of the comments that is reported, I think there were a couple of times, of sort of shooting this guy in a shop and saying this is for Henry Wilson. He's just been shot a couple of days earlier in London or whatever. So I think there are these chains and feedback loops, but there's several. It's kind of cat's cradle. There's different chains and feedback loops that are happening on different regional and very local levels at the same time, and which is driving which in which combination, I think is hard to reconstruct at this distance of time.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think Christopher McGill's recent book covers the incident in the Glens of Antrim.
That's right. He does very well. Which
I think you're familiar with his work. I think the other point, I think, as well as that actual incident in the Glens of Antrim, is the IRA are able to patrol the town and things like that before that happens. So that maybe speaks to the question that was raised earlier about why the IRA aren't able to force areas into the Republic. Now, I know the Glens is physically distant from the border, even if it is a strongly nationalist area. So, I mean, I think that's interesting in itself. I'll read out some of the detail that you mentioned there from Rob McAvoy, who is an archivist in the military archives, who is actually from Dundalk. So, pension files suggest that some 30 individuals mobilised, including from Ravensdale Camp. And interesting, some of those involved left Ireland by 1924. Likely, I think he meant to avoid retaliation. Also, a definite effort in the 30s by some IRA to suppress mention of Altnaveigh, highlighted by the fact that the brigade activity reports don't mention names of those who took part, which is an interesting point, because for those who don't know, brigade activity reports in a lot of cases not only list the activity undertaken by that IRA brigade, as had been decided by a committee of veterans about 10 or 15 years after the fact, but they also quite often list the participants. So then that record would be held by the Department of Defence, so the participants could claim a pension for the activity, which goes back to my point. And there's a similar reticence, I should say, about Bloody Sunday in Dublin, where it's not mentioned. And you see veterans saying things like, well, we were told not to put Bloody Sunday down, but since you're denying me a pension, now I'm going to mention Bloody Sunday.
Interesting. Thank you, Rob. That sort of, that kind of granular knowledge is invaluable. I didn't know that. I'm interested by the 30s attempt. I think there was a comment in, might be the Toby Harlan book, is it, on Bandit Country, of Frank Aiken's son not hearing about Altnaveigh till the 90s or something. That kind of seemed kind of improbable to me, but I might be wrong. So
I should say as well that actually I recently sent Toby Harlan the list from the military archives, the list of the Crossmaglen Company from the military archives, IRA rolls from 1920s, and he was aghast at the crossover of surnames.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that's true.
Very interested to see.
John has a good point here about, isn't the disintegration of the IRA and Aiken's semi-autonomous status in Dundalk in June 22 a factor? Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that, John, and apologies for sort of ducking the question. I sort of wrestled with it briefly. I mean, it clearly does seem suggestive, doesn't it? But why does he authorize it? Assuming he does authorize it, and and unless his papers are all about him saying I couldn't control them, but it doesn't sound likely. I've never seen a hint of that. If it is authorized, why does he authorize it? I mean, there does seem to be a little bit. He's part of the meeting with Owen Duffy on to plan Rosslea in March 21. He apparently comes in late, and there's an interesting comment where he's basically says, "Yeah, hit them once and they won't hit you back," which I mean is actually right. He calls it right, and I just wonder, without having studied Aiken's personality very closely, but I just wonder, is that the logic? Is that the excuse for this kind of attack? That it's the atrocity to end atrocities? It's just that's the thinking. That's how you justify it. It just puts an end to the chain. It's just you up the ante so much it can't be answered. Is that the thinking? I don't know. I'm speculating, but I think John is asking a sharp question there.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that. I do wonder, and I know you just said you're not an expert on Aiken's personality, and neither am I. But I have a question. I think just going to throw a question out there, and you can react or not react. Aiken in the 1950s was very much opposed to nuclear deterrence. So I think it's interesting, just in the parallels you drew with deterrence in this scenario. I wonder to what extent guilt over Altnaveigh may have affected his thinking in this regard.
Well, that's a fascinating potential linkage. I'm sort of, might well be right. I mean, I've been quite, as anyone who's read my work will know, been very influenced by sort of Frank Wright, sort of almost Cold War kind of deterrence model, which, it certainly isn't the full story, but I think can take one a certain way to understanding some of these dynamics. But I think that's perhaps a more plausible linkage from that wonderful phrase in Barrett and Carter's study in Northern Ireland in the early 60s, about the time new Cuban Missile Crisis of 62, of compared to nuclear wipeout, then who marches down the Longston Road or whatever is entirely irrelevant, and that's clearly belongs to the past and isn't going to come back and cause any problems.
Worrying. So I'm gonna leave us with maybe one final slightly provocative question, because it's something I always wrestled with in my own research on the period is to what extent are we on the right track here when we're talking about Altnaveigh? I mean, and I know you have looked at it from, you could subtitle your work in two ways, so I'm conscious of that. And I'm conscious also of the way Altnaveigh, when we're setting up a talk here, we use Altnaveigh because people may be familiar with it and it may attract attention. But my own thought is, to what extent are we on the right track here, talking about the headline events like Altnaveigh or the McMahon killings, or in the South when we're talking about ambushes, or indeed in terms of the history of the Troubles, where John Regan talks about the history of the last atrocity, and makes that parallel throughout, I think, 20th century Irish history. So to what extent, and I think this is something that many actual nationalist and Republican historians might point out, is that there was, as well as the two IRA men shot in Newry, whose funerals had taken place that day, there were, to what extent are we missing the drip feed of the killing, the individual killing? Because we look at the incident where 6 people were killed, do we miss the 10 incidents where 1 person was killed? And I don't know, how do you think we balance that, both in terms of academics researching or local historians researching, or just local people who want to read up on it.
Thanks, Tommy. No, I think it's an excellent question. It sort of links with something that Paddy's just put in there about earlier chains of killing, which all of which I should have nodded to. You're absolutely right. Yes, there is that's the weird thing about these, trying to trace these local chains, as they seem to sort of flare up, then go quiet for a few months, then come back again. There's another killing of a guy called O'Hanlon, a Catholic shot just after Altnaveigh, just a single kind of shooting that usually gets overlooked, and that needs to be folded in too. I think the drip is important. I think this is what I mean really about a sort of small input, large output problem. That it doesn't take much of this killing if there's a general perception that, you know, it could be anyone, then you don't need a lot of it to kind of keep the pot on the boil. I do think there's a danger in looking at the set pieces, and that's kind of ironic really, because I've talked on Altnaveigh tonight, and have written on McMahon murders, but one of the things I was trying to do about McMahon murders is actually say, well, why were people shocked? You know, what was it about this that was atypical, to illuminate a wider landscape, to actually say what was more typical. And I think that sort of sense of, I wouldn't say acceptable conventions, because, you know, if pressed people, you know, many people are not going to say, yeah, this is all right. But, you know, what actually generates outrage compared to what people are able to get on with and kind of ignore if they're not directly affected, I think is a really fascinating question, because it does point to conventions and I think pretty deep assumptions around proportionality. And, you know, I think, again, this goes back to the importance of seeing sectarian violence as signaling. You know, I think we do need to see it as political violence. I think it's enormously condescending and dismissive not to. And it is weird how often it's seen as noises off, as kind of somehow a sideshow to the real political struggle. Not that the Republican insurgency isn't absolutely crucial. I'm not saying it isn't, but I've often always thought that weird. You know, maybe that's just being an outsider, that's what strikes me, and it's not to reduce it either to a kind of reductionist ethnic conflict into communal hatreds point. That's not really my ambition. My interest is in, if society is structured a certain way, why do the actions of a very small number of people create disproportionate fear? Because there's bigots in any society. You know, why is that so apparently destabilizing? And why is there not more of it? Why does it not get worse? But, you know, those are questions I can't resolve definitively tonight. But thank you for the chance to explore them, and for everyone for giving up a slab of their Wednesday night, and for the sharp questions and local knowledge, which is, you know, always, as I say, always humbling to see the sheer amount of granular detail that people know, you know, about these things.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. I should just read out for anyone who might be listening to an audio file that Paddy Mulrow posted there, that there were 3 IRA members killed in June 1921, and their bodies were dumped in Altnaveigh. In reprisal, the IRA targeted men from Altnaveigh on the morning of the truce, killing 1 civilian, Draper Holmes. These events seem to be closely linked with the 1922 murders. I mean, just briefly, Tim, I think that probably may explain the kind of reputation Altnaveigh had, even though they denied having members of being particularly connected with the specials.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, this is kind of why we need the USC files, isn't it? I mean, you know, to actually sort of nail that down or as much as one can ever nail it down. But, you know, we know kind of who signed the covenant or whatever, or, you know, who might have been the UVF, but we don't, you know, there seems a big blur as to, well, actually who was in the specials. You know, was that a perception that was had some substance to it or not?
That's great. Yeah, thanks. I think all we need to do now is I'll virtually applaud Tim and say thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for listening in. I'd echo Tim's comments there, and I would say that tomorrow we will be joined by Dr. Mary Harris of NUI Galway, who will be talking to us about the Catholic Church and partition. So thanks very much, Tim.
No, it's still my pleasure. And, you know, thank you so much for a lively discussion. Cheers now. Good night all.